I'm very excited about today's webinar about learning more about asset mapping, the how, the why, and what next. But before we get started, we want to know who is on the call. So I've put together some poll questions, and the first one is, where are you located? So on your screen, you should see the question, and you just click on the area that you're from. It looks like 63% of those of us on the call is from Ontario or Quebec. We have 19% from British Columbia and Alberta. Unfortunately, we don't have anybody from Manitoba, Saskatchewan, and Northern Territories. We have 4% from New Brunswick, Nova Scotia, PEI, Newfoundland, Labrador, and we have 15% other, which could be from our friends from the South, and Tamarack, where we kind of cover all around the world. So who knows where it could be anywhere, Australia, Denmark. All right, I'm going to close that one, and I'm going to start another one. What is your comfort level with asset mapping? So this one here is just to give us an idea of where everyone is at the call, and it looks like 48% have heard about asset mapping and wanting to learn more. Well, you're on the right call. 35% have done asset mapping and looking for more. So Jonathan, you might want to think about kind of the latest and the greatest if you've done asset mapping. And then 12% have never used asset mapping and are looking for more information. So this is great. You're going to get a lot of information about asset mapping on this call. So thank you very much for participating in that. And it is my pleasure to introduce Jonathan Massimi. Jonathan is a supervisor of community centers with the City of Kitchener. He has worked in a variety of neighborhood settings and is a seasoned asset-based community development practitioner. In 2017, he completed his doctorate where he explored the relationship between ABCDE, or asset-based community development, and communities of faith. His supervisor was John McKnight. Welcome, Jonathan, and over to you.
Well, thank you, Heather. It's a pleasure to be with you all. Even that 10% other, wherever you're from, welcome. So you notice there's a picture there. Some of my friends have commented that my beard looks a lot younger there, and it looks like the camera adds 10 pounds to your beard. So it is me, and I didn't know to Heather that I got my beard trimmed because I knew I'd be on camera. Is there like an applause or a laughter app or thing they could click on? Because I don't know if that joke landed. So in any case, I just want to give you a brief breakdown of this webinar. So there will be 3 sections. Again, because as we noted at the beginning, there are people that have so many different experiences when it comes to asset-based community development, or long-term practitioners, those that have done asset mapping, and so on. So just a brief introduction as our first section. The second, we're talking about asset mapping, a quick how-to, and then finally we're looking at application, short and sweet. So you have brief, quick, short. In practice, when you're actually out in your community, this will be a longer process. So don't let these titles fool you. So we begin with the very first section. So asset-based community development is an approach to mobilizing communities created by Jody Cressman and John McKnight, and it's articulated in their book, Building Communities from the Inside Out. As a starting point, when I often speak of asset-based community development, I do note that it is more philosophy than method. So when I say philosophy, I'm making the point that it's a lens through which one views a place and its residents. Sorry, let me just get the slides going here. So more than often, when we're engaging with a community, we see that place through a needs lens, where the conversation usually focuses on problems, concerns, solutions, and where labels of deficiency are placed on people and places. And when we put those labels on those places and on individuals, it tends to happen that people begin to live into those labels. It, in a sense, blurs people's vision. So we have the needs and the gifts. So focusing on needs blurs people's vision so that they're unable to see the possibilities in their place, where they reside, the possibilities in regards to their neighbors and those around them. And what we find is because their vision is blurred, it causes people simply to stumble around seeking to grasp the hand of the paid professional to help them along. So in contrast, we look at asset-based community development, where it seeks to view a community through a lens of abundance, where the gifts of the local communities are brought to the fore. In a sense, things are brought into focus, where local residents begin to see what they are capable of, that they collectively have the resources available to them to address any issues they may be facing outside of institutional intervention. And thanks to Cormac Russell for this line, asset-based community development focuses on what is strong and not on what is wrong. So as we continue, I'd like to talk about some definitions. So the first definition is assets. So when I'm speaking about assets, I'm looking at the gifts present in a local community. Then the definition of community, there's many floating around, but I landed on three. Community as this geographical connotation in discussing a place. Community, a boundary, can be referred to as a particular community. The second, community as a feeling, a sense of connectedness to other people. And then finally, and I get this out of John McKnight and Peter Block's book, The Abundant Community, community is what occurs outside of systems and institutions. So if you're a service agency or an institution and you're saying, well, we're going to engage in community, the question is, what definition are you using? Are you just entering a place? Are you seeking to build a sense of connectedness? And we'll talk about that a little later. Or what occurs outside of systems and institutions. So if you're entering a space that is community, are you entering a space that is not your own and where you don't call the shots? I'm also going to warn you, I've been strongly influenced by Ivan Illich, so I apologize if I say some things about social service agencies. That you do have a place, and closer to the end of the presentation, I'll show how we can utilize asset-based community development and navigate ways that institutions and services can play a part. And I come from a place being in a municipality, and I'll share a little story of how we've navigated that space as well. So the final definition is development. And I find that this is a word that is very difficult to define. In fact, my experience has been that it's a word that often lures institutions and social agencies toward asset-based community development, in that it is a word that settles quite comfortably within the system and institutional sphere. So I've been reading a book called Plastic Words, and the subtitle is A Tyranny of a Modular Language. And the author is Uwe Perksen. And he has a list of what he considers plastic words, and development is on his list. So for Perksen, such words are pliable and can fit into any context, enabling the speaker to sound authoritative and important. He says that plastic words often begin as regular words with specific meanings, but are then adopted and become part of a scientific or professionalized lingo. So after they're adopted, they are in turn released back into everyday contexts, taking on obscure meanings. So what we're finding in terms of individuals that are utilizing asset-based community development, there's been a shift in how we describe it. And for fans of Wheel of Fortune, the question we begin to ask here is, can I buy a vowel? And the vowel will be E. So there is this trend emerging where people are beginning to speak about asset-based community-driven efforts. So asset-based community-driven efforts. And when we, again, look at the definitions, what are the assets in a place? Community, if we define it as connectedness, but specifically about things that sphere that functions outside of institutions and services. So how does that sphere drive the efforts in a community? So again, based on these definitions, we can see that asset-based community development or asset-based community-driven efforts, its philosophy is a means by which people outside of systems and institutions utilize their gifts to drive efforts in their own particular context. And another important note about ABCD or ABCDE, there are three principles that are at its core. So at the heart of ABCD, the first is the giving of gifts. And here is the gifts of people in our neighborhood are boundless. So that's saying that we focus on abundance and the gifts that are present in our place and in the people that live there. The second principle is the presence of association. So a gift isn't a gift until it's given. So in association, we join our gifts together and they become amplified, magnified, productive, and celebrated. So in association, bringing the various gifts together. And then finally, the compassion of hospitality. So hospitality is an important part. We welcome strangers. We welcome those that may not be familiar to us because we value their gifts. And in turn, we have a need to share our own gifts. So that said, on air. So that's our first section. And I discussed with Heather about after every section, opening it up to any questions, anything you'd like to clarify, maybe even something you'd like to add. Now's the time to do it. Again, throughout the presentation, there'll be times for you to do so.
So if you want to raise your hand, we can unmute you and you can ask your question. There are some questions in the question box here, Jonathan, about they'd love to learn more about your PhD work. So we will give your contact information and people can connect with you more. But one was something about you said you were influenced by whom? So
Ivan Illich. And he also was a great friend of John McKnight and had a wonderful influence on John McKnight as well. And kind of influenced me in talking about the limits of institutions to care for individuals. So how do we work within our limits? It is an important teaching that I got from Illich.
And what's the spelling?
IVAN ILLICH.
All right, let's move on.
Okay, so asset map, a quick how-to. So this gentleman here is Cormac Russell. As of late, he's been influencing my thought. He's been sending me wonderful articles, and we've been sharing some of our work through Facebook, which is a great medium, especially he's in Ireland. So when he speaks about asset mapping, and this is from an article, and it's taking a couple of points out of this article he wrote titled, "Should the term asset map be put into room 101?" And again, I'll provide Heather with all the links and the names of these articles. So his first point, and these are words of caution as we're engaging in asset mapping. He says that asset mapping is not intended to be about data gathering by institutions, but about building relationships between neighbors. So asset-based community development, and I'll be writing about this in November. Speaking about asset-based community development as certain practices that draw us closer together as individuals in a neighborhood, and that the goal of asset-based community development, as I see it, is friendship. And I kind of unpack what friendship means and how asset-based community development as a practice and as a philosophy can help us connect with others. So again, asset mapping is not intended to be about data gathering, but its end goal is to build relationships between neighbors. The second is, it's asset mapping must be owned by the community. If it is not, then it can be misused to feed the agendas of agencies, where asset mapping turns into asset stripping, and volunteers are recruited as cheap alternatives to programs and services. So a group utilizes it and says, okay, here are all the assets in the community, let's utilize it for our purposes. So it ends up creating a situation where we find warm bodies to volunteer for us, or we have then identified cheap labor in the community, again, to serve our institutional agendas. And then lastly, sorry, my light, I have this sensor in my office and it turns the light off for some reason. So if I'm waving, I'm not losing my mind. So much power in my hands to turn on a light. And then lastly, he uses a metaphor from building. He goes, asset mapping is analogous to the scaffolding that goes up around a house. He goes, we have been witness to a number of examples where outside agencies have done an asset map to or for communities and assume they have completed some action step. He says, imagine a developer putting up scaffolding around a building you wanted developed and claiming they were finished simply because they'd erected the scaffolding. He goes, well, that's exactly what people who are doing asset mapping to or for communities are saying to those communities. We've done the map, so now your community is built. But in fact, no connecting has been done. More importantly, it was done by the wrong people. And this is the point he emphasizes. Asset mapping should be done and owned by local residents. And again, it's not to say that institutions can't and agencies can engage in it, but where is our starting point? So the assets we're looking to uncover and bring to light in our community. There's a total of 6 I'm going to emphasize. The first being the gifts of local residents. And John McKnight kind of instilled this in me, the three gifts, the gifts of the head. So things I know something about and would enjoy talking about with others. Gifts of the hands, so those things or skills I know how to do and would like to share with others. And then finally, gifts of the heart, things I care about. The next is the gifts of local associations. And when we speak of associations, groups of 2 or more residents join together around a common activity or interest, often sharing a common passion, care, and interest. And when we're speaking about associations, we look at the individuals within it and ask, what are the gifts of the head, hands, and heart within that association? Next, we talk about identifying the gifts of local institutions. And again, they're noted there are 3 kinds of institutions: profit, not-for-profit, and governmental. And this is an important point. Unlike associations, their members are paid to do the work. And then gifts of physical space. So focus is on the built environment. Gifts of local economy. And in a recent article that John McKnight and Cormac Russell wrote, it's called The 4 Essential Elements of Any Asset-Based Community Development Process. They take a different spin on economy and in the sharing of goods. So again, I'll give that link to Heather. And there's some things I agree with, some things I'm still thinking through. But when I speak of gifts of local economy, and again, it's coming out of my experience, we speak about businesses that hire all their employees and purchase all their supplies from within the local community, and trying to uncover businesses that donate goods and services to community-run initiatives. And this is something that's very important. The gifts of local stories. Story can be very powerful. When we speak of stories, we speak of the narratives and memories of community members, where we remind neighbors of how they have done things successfully in the past. I often say, putting on my municipal hat, institutions collect statistics, communities collect stories, and it's stories that inspire and spark people's passion toward community-driven initiatives. So we have those 6 gifts or assets that we're looking to identify in the community. So when we are looking to create an inventory of local residents, and I'm going to go through some questions that I personally have used in collecting the information from neighbors or various community members. So again, at its core, asset-based community development begins with the gift of the individual, the gifts of those in the community space. So the questions are, and after I read these questions, I'm going to share ways that we've done this. So what are you good at? What do you care about? What do you know well enough to teach? What organizations do you belong to? And this is an important question I've found, where you say, what organizations do you belong to? And that provides, so if someone says, oh, I'm part of this neighborhood association, for example, then you have someone that is almost an inside person that can connect you and help you navigate that space and introduce you to the players within that association. And then finally, what would you like to learn? The phrasing of these questions, I like to thank a fellow practitioner, Julie Philippek, who I've gotten to know for the last couple of years. And this is some questions that she has utilized with youth in her context. From the city level, we're experimenting at various ways we can ask these questions. At one of the centers that I'm responsible for, we are sending out Google polls asking these questions and collecting that. We're experimenting with point of sale questionnaires. So when people are registering for a program, we can begin to ask these questions. Also, I'm using these questions as I start to go out in my own neighborhood. I moved just over a year ago, and I'm getting to know my neighbors. And I'm not going around with like a clipboard, but I have these questions in the back of my mind. So when I'm engaged with neighbors, so what are you into? What do you like doing? Oh, what do you care about? And it becomes a conversation starter. And it's amazing when you begin to ask people what they're passionate about and what gifts they have to offer, how they open up. One of the barriers people note when engaging in this first step, they're like, well, I'm afraid to engage with my neighbor. So the first barrier is actually within yourself, and the fear to actually go out and connect with another person. And I find the language so interesting where we begin to talk about, well, I don't want to go to my neighbor's house because I don't want to invade their privacy. I find that is an interesting term, that we're going to get to know our neighbor. We're seen as invading. It's almost like we're this foreign power entering into their space where we're unwanted. But my experience has been people are very welcoming, especially if you're a neighbor and you're taking an interest in their lives and the things that they would be willing to offer to their community. So those are the questions for the gifts of local residents. So the gifts of local associations. Good question. Asking association, what do you do? Tell me about yourselves. Second, what do you do that helps people other than members of your organization? Next, what are you willing to do that you are currently not doing? So helping to see, are they engaged in any visioning process? Are they looking at ways to engage in their community in different ways? Next, what are you willing to do that you are currently not doing? And then finally, what is a hope your organization has for our community? So to see if these associations within the community align with some of the things people are articulating in the first step, where we look at the gifts of local residents. Next, the gifts of local institutions. So the questions I like to ask are, how are you currently serving the community? What are ways you have offered support to community initiatives? How can you or your institution become more community serving? And then the gifts of physical space. Where are the places that people gather? Right? Are there great coffee shops in your neighborhood? Where do people like to hang out? In my neighborhood, I'm finding that there's this park where a group of older gentlemen like to play cards every day, and that's their gathering space. And they have found connection with one another in the park. Second, what spaces are available for community initiatives? And one of the challenges for community groups is space. Like where do we host events? Where can we have a party in the wintertime? So what are the spaces available for community initiatives? And then where do people like to meet? So again, coffee shops, or when someone's like, hey, we're gonna have a meeting, what's the constant place people would like to meet? And I know in my neighborhood, there's a couple of places that people always like to reference. Then the gifts of local economy, and this is questions we could ask local businesses. When hiring, do you tend to hire local residents? Next question, do you purchase supplies locally? Third, what community initiatives have you participated in? And then finally, what are some things you think you could offer the community? And then the gifts of local stories. So do you remember a time where members of the community worked together? Second, was there a time you felt connected? And I was part of this panel discussion where we asked that one question to a group of people. I think there was like 45 in attendance, and we said, was there a time you felt connected? And we just let them loose. The conversation lasted for close to 2 hours. It actually disrupted our agenda because we were just going with the energy. When was there a time you felt connected? And that's just a very broad question, and it opens up a space for people to share. Then third, what makes you proud of your community? So again, switching the lens, where's the abundance? Where are the gifts within your community? Next. Before I move on, are there any questions there?
So if you have any questions, just raise your hand and we'll unmute you and you can ask your question. But actually, I do have a question for you while we're waiting. When you're doing your asset mapping, do you have to do all 6, or can you pick and choose which gifts you want to identify?
I'll talk about that a little later, but when I'm going out in a community and saying identifying assets, there are particular. So John McKnight has this article, which I'm going to reference later, neighborhood necessities. So the 7 functions that only effectively organized neighborhoods can provide. And so let's say I had an issue with kind of employment, finding people work within a community. Well, one of the places I would start is having conversations with local businesses. Are you hiring? Do you hire local people? And start to make that connection. It's not to say that, for example, the gifts of individuals couldn't lead to employment, where someone says, well, I'm good at working and I have a business, and so based on something you like to address as a community, that's actually a good starting point to begin asking those questions. But I find going through all of those questions kind of inspire people to see, wow, there's a lot of things happening in our community, especially when we begin with the gifts of local residents.
Okay.
So you can pick and choose, but I would say you'll miss out if you don't try to map everything.
And we do have another question about how does empowerment fit with asset mapping? What does empowerment mean within the ABCD context?
Empowerment. I think when I think of empowerment within an asset-based community development framework, it is allowing, and this is a Peter Block line, allowing residents or citizens to be architects of their own future. So in the sense that it allows people in a place to determine what that place will be, utilizing their own skills at hand. So when we look at deficiency and saying, here are the things that you're lacking, I find it actually disempowers people. So saying to people, you have the tools here to create something. Go at it. And I think that leads to this empowerment. It just gives people a different view of themselves and their community and their capabilities. Mm-hmm. As I understand empowerment.
And it's funny because you don't know what you have until somebody points it out. Mm-hmm. So I didn't know I had the communication skill. I just did it, right? And then somebody would point it out to me, and then it empowered me to communicate more and share what I had. So I think the asset mapping, once you do it, it is an empowerment tool. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. We have one last question and then we'll move on, is how do you address inequalities within this framework? Socioeconomic, race, etc.
Well, the interesting thing is, as a philosophy, it's been used across communities, varying communities with different cultural and socioeconomic makeups. It's actually proven to be quite useful in communities that have been labeled as deficient. It empowers, as we talked about before. So as a method, again, and as a philosophy, I don't expect asset-based community development to answer all the problems. I do see it as a great starting point where people begin to see themselves and their place differently. So yes, there may be things that, and I'm going to talk about this, the three essential questions. Um, what can people do for themselves? So again, with their gifts, what can people do with outside help? So that kind of that support. And then what can't people do and require outside help? So kind of looking at that, not expecting this approach to solve all the problems or address all the issues, but I think it's a pretty good starting place. And my experience in certain communities, even in the Kitchener area, where we utilized it in communities where, again, cultural diversity and identified as neighborhoods that are struggling socioeconomically. And it's been a breath of fresh air for that community, because they said, well, here are things we can do for ourselves. And it is encouraging to see that. And I apologize if I skated around the question, but I've heard that before. Again, I don't expect it to have all the answers, but I do firmly believe it is a way of getting people to look at themselves and their community differently.
Yeah, and I'd actually say it's actually simple.
Mm-hmm.
And it's, in terms of language, it's, what is your gift? It's easy to understand. So no matter what education level, your background, the questions are very simple, that it helps to, address that piece of it, because of its simplicity.
And when we're going out in the community, it's not that people are filling out pages and pages of surveys,
Mm.
right? It's, again, it can, certain questions can be inserted in a normal conversation, right?
Mm-hmm.
So, and again, if there are language barriers, maybe that's one of the questions you ask is, how many languages do you speak? And then and get that person to come around with you. And we've done that in some of the neighborhoods that I've worked in. And it was very helpful going door to door and introducing and having that person that's able to connect and ask these questions. It was very liberating for those on the other end. So once we have these various inventories, if you want to call it, and we've taken account of all these assets, it's important to make these assets visible. And if you look at the various individuals that have spoken about asset-based community development, that have spoken of asset mapping, this is kind of a typical template that's used in discussions, and that we encourage community members to create. Again, you're not really bound to this template. I think when we speak about asset mapping, is how do we take all that we've collected and simply make it visible to those in our community? How can we gather at a table and look at all the things that are available to us, and how do we begin to utilize what is available to us for some of the issues we may be facing? I came across in my internet travels another way someone has done it, and they had connections, and this was an asset map with a particular lens toward a street party. So they talked about the personal, professional, online, geographical assets, things that people were able to do. What are the linkages? For those that like neat and tidy visuals, this isn't that. And then something a little close to home. There was a wonderful little initiative that started in one of the centers I oversee in collaboration with our public library, and a student doing an internship, and this is how she did it. And I think it was very, very wonderful, where she actually took the map of the community and started plotting, and also encouraged others to plot where the various assets were. And she asked multiple questions. One of the questions I thought that was interesting in terms of place, she says, where do you find belonging? And people were noting that on the map as well. And then again, asking the gifts of what are the gifts you're able to give, and there was a box there, and ways we can connect people based on interests. So that slowly began to happen. But this map I thought was great because people said, "Hey, well, I live on this street. Here are some gifts. Here are that," and it brought to light, I thought, in a wonderful way, what was available to that community. So a point I would like to make about asset mapping is it firmly grounds us in a time and place. So it grounds us in the present. So what I've found is asset-based community development, asset mapping uh, helps us to fight two impulses, the nostalgic and the utopic. And I find that focusing on the nostalgic impulse or the utopic impulse draws us into a deficiency mindset. So when I'm working with communities and they say, well, I remember 20 years ago, we had this or we did that, and look at today, or someone brings up the 50s and how great that was, it brings into the present what we're lacking. We don't have this anymore. We don't have these initiatives anymore. And this is not to say that bringing up the stories and kind of reminiscing is a bad thing, but when it slips into that impulse to say, well, we don't have what we used to have, so we can't move forward, or let's try to recreate what we had, and we impose a vision of the past onto a community and its members. Then we have the utopic, where we look forward and we say, if only we had A, B, C, D, E, F, G, whatever in place, then our community would be amazing. And again, both impulses cause us to look at the present through a deficiency lens. So I like to say that asset-based community development grounds us in the present, helps us to be aware of what is available to us now, and how do we move forward. So application, short and sweet. Okay, so this is one of the centers overseas. It's called Country Hills Community Center. And when I first started there, we had a lot of youth issues. So this is a lot of our centers have youth hanging out in the lobbies, some misbehaving, some vandalizing. So all these things were happening. And what I intentionally did was week after week, I sat in that space and I took in what was happening. And I sat with the chaos. I tried not to bring in my solutions. I said, what's emerging here? What's happening? And what I noted was that many of the students were coming right after school, so 3:30, and staying at the center till it closed. So one of the things that I started to ask was, well, are they having dinner? Are they eating? What are they doing for food? The second was I noted that the adults in their lives that were not their parents would engage with them in a policing manner. So when they were doing something wrong, then they would have an interaction with an adult telling them that they've done something wrong. The third thing I began to ask was, well, where's the space where they can just be? And maybe the lobby's not it. Is there other rooms in our center? And then finally, I started to ask, well, what about safety? Do they feel safe in this space? If they weren't here, where would they be? And then in turn, do our staff feel safe in engaging with the youth? So looking at those, so food, mentorship, security, place, I ran those through a filter. And this is the filter, the 7 community functions: health, safety and security, environment, economy, food, raising of children, and care. So again, this is in John McKnight's article, Neighborhood Necessity, 7 Functions That Only Effectively Organized Neighborhoods Can Provide. So first, health. He notes many studies have proven the correlation between our well-being and our built-in social environments. And this is something that McKnight notes, how long we live and how often we are sick is largely determined by our personal behavior, our social relationships, our physical environment, and our incomes. Then safety and security. Safety and security also falls under the neighborhood domain. Again, McKnight notes that there are 2 determinants of local safety. One is how many neighbors we know by name. The second is how often we are present and associate in the public space outside of our homes. And then environment. Many of our actions have negative impact on the environment. The following are those under our control: how we transport ourselves, how we heat and light our homes, and how much waste we create is a major factor in saving the earth. Again, being conscious of time amidst going through this. So economy, the power to build a resilient economy lies within local neighborhoods. Most local enterprises begin locally in garages, basements, and storefronts. Neighbors have a vital role in supporting these businesses so that they have a viable market. And then food, what we eat and what we and where we buy our food affects not only our personal health, but the health of our local economy. Again, the next one, raising of children. That saying, it takes a village to raise a child. Unfortunately, we have outsourced this responsibility, and this is what McKnight says: we pay systems to raise our children, teachers, counselors, coaches, nutritionists, doctors, McDonald's, and MTV. And as families, we are often reduced to being responsible for paying others to raise our children and transporting them to their paid child raisers. And then finally, care. Care is something institutions cannot offer, for it cannot be provided, managed, or purchased from systems. Rather, McKnight argues, care is a freely given commitment from the heart of one to another. So when I was looking at what was happening in the center, I went through this filter. I said, I can come up with policies and procedures, but as we go through this, what are the community functions? What role does the community have? These youth being in our center is not just a staff issue. It's an issue that we would like to make the community aware, and how do we mobilize the community to become part of it? So I looked at this and said, well, food, it's something that's within a function of community. The raising of children, safety and security, and ultimately care. So what we've done is so in terms of the raising of children, we're slowly taking inventory of adults in the community, and we're saying, what are you good at? What are some skills that you'd be willing to share with youth? And we've created a space where we're connecting youth and adults through the sharing of skills. Food, how can we begin to access food locally? Are there local restaurants that'd be willing to donate, like that, so that we can provide food for the kids at our center? And then safety and security. Are we aware of what's happening in the community? Do we know the names as a center of the neighbors around? And when we're engaging with the youth, knowing of someone's name and where they're from contributes to safety. So kind of the litmus I go through with our staff is, when we're engaging with youth, do they know your name? Do you know their name? Do they ask about you when you're not there? And then finally, do you notice when they're not there, and do you care? And so anyway, looking at the time, something that came out of this, again, from a city perspective, we said, what's within our capabilities, what's within our limits is, as a city, we own the space. But in turn, how do we hold the space for the community itself to engage? And how do we welcome youth and adults into this space to connect with others in meaningful ways? So something we're working on, and it's launching on November 5th, is a skills library, where we've been in contact with local makers, local congregations, associations, patrons of the center as they're coming in, asking them to fill out inventories, looking at volunteers and saying, what would you like to offer to youth? Again, skills as a path to building relationships of care. And a friend of mine says care and mutual delight. So that's kind of a story about the process and how we recognize something in the community, and then in turn we're seeking the community's assets to begin to address it. And we as an institution, knowing our limits, saying, what can the community do for itself? Well, according to these capacities, here are the things they could do for themselves. But in turn, as a city, here are the things that we can only do. And it's the managing of the building and the providing of the space in the community. So again, those questions: what can residents do for themselves? We begin there. What can residents do for themselves with outside help? And then finally, what can't residents do for themselves and require outside help? The unfortunate thing is, and the order of those questions are very important. So often we begin with the last question: what can't residents do for themselves and require outside help? And then we provide our solutions to the problems that we see, rather than the other way around, where it's the community that asks of us this: hey, listen, we can't do this, can you help? And that's where I want to end, and with 5 minutes to spare for some questions.
So there's a question from Carla. What does an asset map look like in a public space? I think you showed some examples. Should phone numbers, contact information be on it? So can you just talk a little bit about the collection process, I guess?
So in terms of the collection process, when it's in a public space, I would not suggest you put people's, like, maybe a first name or even initials if you're looking at showing that. But for those that are filling it out a little bit more in depth, here are my gifts, here are my, can I contact you, things like that. I think a little box for people to put it in is a great way of collecting that information. So we're also want to be attentive to to people's comfort levels. Maybe they don't want their names out there or for all to see, but they would be comfortable if 1 or 2 people contact them through the sharing of this this card that they filled out. Yeah, and that the picture I showed, that was in a community center lobby. So, and it was very much an interactive piece.
We had an asset-based community development workshop in Kitchener in the springtime, and we asked all the attendees to bring something that represented their gift. And they were objects, like someone brought a jar of pickles. Someone brought like one of those multi media toggles because they're a connector. And so there are ways of, like, really fun and unique ways, to gather the input from the community.
Yeah, I've also invited people to go out into their community with cameras and take pictures of places and individuals that they see as gifts.
Yeah.
And then bring that back, and we begin to talk about it.
Another question is about resources to do this. Is it, financial resources, human resources, your time resources? Can you just talk a little bit about that in your experience?
I find, if you want to talk about being cost effective as a method, it can be very simple. Just going to your neighbor and asking some questions. And I do have on my computer someone that has taken some pictures of, they go out with recipe cards and ask their neighbor questions, and then they place it on this this filing system that they created where they begin to take inventory of the gifts in their community. So it can be very simple. And I've also seen it be very complex where people have online databases and maps and things um, so it can be very, I don't know, how much is a pack of recipe cards? You get from $1, and I've seen it up to $50,000 plus. But um, personally, I believe in starting small, beginning local, and try to get a group of a small group of neighbors out in their community asking those questions.
Mm-hmm.
Because if you get too big, then you get caught up in systems questions. Well, what platform do you use? What about this and what about that? And I found when I was on the other end of things, we started talking more about the computer programs rather than the community.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. I just recently actually had a question a while ago about platforms
Mhm.
and how do you what do you do with this information once you have it? So she was looking for platforms, and I know that's up and coming in terms of the tech world. There's a lot of platforms that are starting to develop to map out these and be easier. I do know the Abundant Edmonton has a platform where they map out the assets. And you can go online and say, you know what, I want to go golfing today. And you can go in and type golfing and the neighborhood, and it'll pull up people who have agreed to be on there and match up. But that's huge. And they've been doing this for a long time. So I like your comment about keeping it simple.
Well, we utilized when I used to work at United Way, we utilized Howard stuff. We tried that platform out,
Mm,
and we found there were a lot of questions coming out. Well, who owns the information?
yeah.
Um, this that so there's we I was just finding the whole conversation was just about the method or the technology rather than how are we connecting people. Um, so again, I'm not saying databases and these things are a bad thing, but I've seen power in a couple of people in their community going out and getting to know their neighbors.
Mm. Well, the Carla just wrote in saying we're putting our information on painted chalkboards along a hall in our not-profit next to the food pantry, so people can like write it down and share their gifts. I think that's a great idea. And the chalkboard is what, $20?
Yeah. Send us pictures, please.
But I have one question for everybody who's still on the call, and thank you for staying on. I know we're past the time. Um, when we were putting this, Jonathan and I were putting this together, we were wondering that this could go a little bit deeper. We could be talking more about this. This webinar is just an overview, but um, we're wondering if anyone is interested in continuing this and, you know, maybe helping with sharing your stories of asset mapping and, you know, diving into this a little bit deeper. So if you click on yes, the program lets me know that like who said yes and who said no, and I can get into contact with you afterwards. How can you learn more? Where can you find more information? We have some amazing websites. The Asset-Based Community Development Canada website has a lot of information on there. A lot of what Jonathan talked about in terms of the articles that John McKnight wrote are on there. And another good way of staying in touch in the latest and greatest is our neighborhood community journal that comes out bi-monthly. The next slide is about a workshop that's coming up. So if you're in the Calgary area, evaluation and design, I do know that we all don't evaluate enough. And how do you do that in a systems change? So this is a great workshop to dive into that and learn a little bit more. And we also have a webinar coming up about the key to successes in resident-led community change approaches. And Justy talks about belonging and the belonging lens, which really goes with the asset-based community development stuff. And, you know, how do we transform our strategies and our relationships? And so she's going to be coming on in December. So I'd love to see you all on that call. And lastly, I just wanted to let you know about an opportunity. It's a local deepening community initiative opportunity that builds on the theory of asset-based community development. And we're looking for organizations who are wanting to host conversations within their communities to find the gifts, the assets. And it's a 6-step process that you partner with us, with Tamarack, and we coach you along, kind of train the trainer. You learn new skills on how to do this work, and then you become part of a national movement. And we're looking for 5 local communities, and I mean local as in Canadian-wide communities, to do this work in. So if you're interested, please send me an email, heather@tamarackcommunity.ca, and we can start talking more, and I can give you a bit more information about this opportunity. And lastly, thank you. Thank you so much for taking the time out of your busy day to learn about asset mapping. And we really do look forward to continuing this conversation and learning from you as you are embarking on this journey of asset mapping.